Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee. John Quincy, the chair, and we're joined by Council members Yang, Palmisano, Johnson, and Council Vice President Glidden. And so we are a quorum, and we'll continue the agenda for the day. We have a number of consent items that I'd like to run through. And feel free if there's any questions or comments you'd like to make, and we'll pull those for discussion. But the first item is a contract amendment. It's with Premier Electrical Corporation for work at the Convention Center. We also have a for Fire Station 15 floor reconstruction with a contract amendment with Loeffler Construction Consulting. We have the 2017 property tax special assessment of delinquent utility charges. Item number 4 is a contract amendment with the Met Council for additional scope and services of several projects related to transportation, employee paid transportation benefits. Item number 5 is a grant for Homeland Security for rail and pipeline exercise. This accepted those funds from that agency. Contract amendment with Fahey Sales Auctioneers and Appraisers, as well as a contract with Hiller Auction Services. Those are for decommissioned equipment. Item number 8 is a contract with Kimley Horn and Associates, and this is for the Hennepin Avenue project. And reconstruction project engineering design services. Item 9 is a contract amendment with Clear Night Group. Contract amendment with EMA Inc. for technical services. Item 11 is a contract amendment with Semstone Products for ready mix concrete. Item 12 is a contract amendment with Thomas & Sons for the construction of 26th Avenue North. Item 13 is a contract amendment with Tiller Corporation for commercial asphalt. Item 14 is bids for various water utility materials. That's accepting the low responsive bid from Minnesota Pipe and Equipment. Item 15 is the Twin Cities Public Health and Environmental Health Entities Mutual Aid Agreement. Item number 16 is amendments to notes for various outstanding city homebuyer assistance loans. And item 17 is the application for an environmental grant funding. This is the 2017 Brownfield Grant Round. So there's grant applications with Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, Met Council's Tax-Based Revitalization Account, and Hennepin County Environmental Response Fund. So those are the 17 items I had identified as consent items. Any questions on those items? We do have Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering if staff had more information on item number 9. On that item, I see the contract is recommended to be increased by $45,000. I'm just wondering, I thought the project was wrapping up next month, and I was wondering what the additional communications and public relations services would be on Nicollet Mall reconstruction, moving beyond today's timeline.
Great question. Let me see if I can find the item. There's item number 9. Is there anybody here from Transportation Public Works or Communications that could help us with that? Micah, do you know of any additional information? Mr. Ruff, can you offer anything? Let's go ahead and pull that if we could for this item. See if I can get somebody down to outline some of those changes. So if we can get some staff here to respond to that, I'd like to make sure we address that for Councilmember Johnson's question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. So for all the remaining items, except for item 9 on the consent agenda, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those items all pass, and we'll hold item 9 over for some questions as soon as we can get some staff down to respond. But that does not say we can't continue the agenda, and we'll look at the first of our discussion item, which is from Community Solar Garden subscription agreements. And Mr. Milberg, you have a presentation, and we'll open up for any discussions on that. So whenever you're ready, please begin.
Committee Chair Quincy, council member, committee members. I'm here today. My name is Brian Milberg. I'm the energy manager for the city. I'm here today to discuss the results of our low-income housing community solar request for proposals. We went out with a proposal to try and assist low-income households in participating in this type of a solar garden. And I have 4 parts of the presentation. We'll quickly go through how a garden works again, what the key elements of the proposal were, the financial pricing of the respondents that we selected, and then the benefits that will accrue to the city and the low-income housing households. Just as a reminder, the community solar garden is basically a company builds a solar array and gives the electricity to Xcel for free. We continue to get all of our electricity from Xcel just as usual. The only change now is that every month Xcel knows how much electricity we received from the subscription to the community solar garden, and they give us a credit shown by that green arrow that goes against our electricity cost for the month. And then in addition, we have to send a separate billing to the solar garden operator. The prices for this electricity, the garden operator prices their electricity somewhat less than the credit, and so there's a net benefit to the customer. In this particular example, we would have saved 5% on the monthly bill with the prices shown in this example. When this program came out, there quickly were applications for 1,000 solar gardens. There are about 300 that are built now and starting operation. Unfortunately, these gardens are mostly supplying to large industrial customers and commercial enterprises, and then residential households that had very high FICO scores. So these were people with credit scores above 700. This is what the investors in these gardens required to invest in these assets. So the city decided we would try to sponsor a garden where we could get low-income people to participate without these credit limits. We went out with an RFP, and basically there were several requirements in the RFP. First, once the garden was built, the subscriptions, 20% of the subscriptions at least, at a minimum, had to go to low-income households, and that was defined as 80% of the median family income in Hennepin County. The next item was, even though we are not building the gardens ourselves, we're not actually paying for it, the gardens will have to follow all of our standard construction guidelines, such as women and minority business, enterprise, and the overall project goals, as well as the women and minority labor goals for the actual construction. The gardens also had to agree that there would be no upfront cost, so that basically you would only be paying for the electricity you get each month, and that some of these gardens, we've noticed the subscription rate, you're actually losing a little money initially. And in this case, we made the gardens commit that at least the low-income households would always be making some money on the subscription. Now, based on past experience, we knew that it might be difficult to get developers to bid on such a project. So we tried to offer some incentives. One was that the city would immediately become a 20% subscriber as an anchor tenant for the garden so that they would have a large tenant to take to their investors. We also agreed to that they did have to sign up at least 20% of the garden to low-income households, but if over time some of those failed to pay and they had to find new customers, they were required to search for another low-income household, that if after 3 months of searching they could not sign another subscription, the city would take over that subscription. We would not be paying for any of the back months of missed or lapsed bills, but from the day we took the subscription, we would carry forward. We're allowed by law to take up to 40% of the garden. So we have this 20% buffer where we can backfill. And then as a further incentive, these gardens are usually sited on open land. And we realized that we had land at the water treatment site, that perhaps if we could site the garden there on our reservoirs, it would save the developers money. The goal was hopefully to get the developers to quote a garden in general farmland, which is how most of them are built, and then also to propose a garden on the city land to see if there was a cost savings there. Unfortunately, that great scheme did not work out too well for us. We got 7 proposals, which was very good. 2 of the developers were not interested in the water treatment sites. They only proposed doing off-site gardens. And the other 5 developers were only interested in the water treatment facility sites. So we never got an apples-to-apples comparison of pricing. I wanted to put the ranking, how we scored all the proposals here, just to show that while price is obviously very important, it was only 25% of the rating. The bulk of the rating went to such items as experience and quite a bit to their ability to attract the low-income households, because they are going to be in charge of the outreach to do these subscriptions. After ranking all the proposals, we ended up choosing the 2 top-ranked proposals, both of which do not use the water treatment facility as sites. The 2 companies are Rena Sola, which is an international company, which does have a local office, and they have numerous gardens under construction in the Twin Cities, and then Renewable Energy Partners, which is a local company. There was no limit on the number of gardens they could propose, and Rena Solar proposed 2 gardens, Renewable Energy Partners 1, and you can see the pricing. In both of these, and actually all of the proposals we received, the respondents are charging the city a little more than the residents so that they can give more saving to the low-income households. In this particular first-ranked proposal, we were paying 13 cents, and this company has signed a fixed amount that will be the same amount for 25 years. Based on this, you can see in the last column there, we show the savings, and we're showing for the low-income households, over a 25-year period, they can save about $15,000. It's about $600 a year, so it's quite favorable. Renewable Energy Partners is a smaller garden, and you notice their pricing is even less. However, as happens with these gardens who are actually below the retail cost of electricity, they usually put an escalator in, and this cost will go up 1.25% each year. But even so, the low-income households are still saving over a quarter of their bill. One thing I want to point out is you see the higher price saves more than the lower price. And this is an artifact of what's happening with the Public Utilities Commission regulation. The Rena Solar Garden was actually submitted before December 31st, 2016 to Xcel Energy to get into their queue for gardens. On January 1st, a new tariff came in, and it's not as favorable as the gardens that were grandfathered in before January 1st. And so even with this lower price, you notice that the older garden is saving people more. One of the things that we also ranked was, well, how many people can these gardens help? And what I show here in the bottom section, the same 2 companies, the number of low-income households. A standard household uses about 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. The households do not have to sign up for their entire yearly amount, but if they do, the Rena Solar with 2 gardens would serve 71 households, and the Renewable Energy Partners would serve 31. Now, this is with the 20% that they've guaranteed. Both developers have said that they would be willing to sign up more low-income households. So in theory, the numbers could go as high as 4 times that number. So it could be significant. And then we also, as I said, we wanted to make sure that these people are interacting with local organizations to help them find these people. And we've listed, each of them has 3 fairly well-known, long-standing, low-income agencies in the Twin Cities that specifically deal with housing. So just to show a little bit of financial graph, here is the savings to the city. Now remember, the city is getting a full 20% of the garden, so our savings are obviously going to be higher than a single household. But you see that this is cumulative in today's dollars. They're both, after 25 years, over that time period, we save between $140,000 and $165,000 on that subscription. As I stated, the low-income households had to always be cash positive. And here you see the effect of that change in the tariff, the yellow line being the older garden. They can save almost twice as much over 25 years. But still, it would be at least $300 a month with the blue line, $300 a year savings for the low-income households. In this action, we're proposing that Property Services staff is authorized to start contract negotiations. This will be a little different than a standard subscription agreement, which is now pretty much a boilerplate type contract. There's so many of them in the state. We'll obviously be signing that, but we will be involving the city attorney's office to work on a separate contract to go over how they're going to get the low-income households, this whole transfer of subscriptions if they fall by the wayside. So that'll be a separate contract that'll be signed at the same time.
Good. Are there any questions for Ms. Milberg? Mr. Milberg? Excuse me. Not seeing any. Is there? How do we verify that these actual savings are being realized by the low-income subscribers?
So what will be required, actually, Xcel Energy keeps track of all the subscriptions. And in that separate contract, we won't look at the individual data because that's obviously private, but we would ask for an aggregated amount of how many subscriptions, the dollar amounts that were saved. Because on each bill, you see a calculation of the credit and how much the credit is on each bill.
Okay.
So Excel can easily report that to us.
Good. And this is going to require some construction of some solar gardens, especially at the water facility. Or excuse me, where? Go ahead.
Yeah. So the Rena Solar is going to be in typical solar garden, be on open area in Sherburne and Anoka County. Mm-hmm. The Renewable Energy Partners, actually, they're trying to site it on North High School. And if that doesn't work, they'll be putting it on some other commercial roofs on the north side of Minneapolis.
Okay. And what's the timeline that they would be able to make those installations?
The Anoka and Sherburne County, we predict that by late third quarter, early fourth quarter of 2018, we'll receive power from them. The Renewable Energy Partners, it's a roof-based facility. It'll take a little more time to build. That possibly may not come in until the first quarter of 2019, hopefully by the end of 18.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Very helpful. Any questions? Not seeing any. I'd like to move approval of this item. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? And that carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Milberg, for all the work, Property Services, to bring that about. I saw Ms. Cerny earlier. I think if we could take up item 9 before we can begin the other topic.
Sure.
If Ms. Cerny and
Mr.
Mr.
Elwood's
Elwood
here
could
to
be
answer the
able to
question.
speak to Councilmember Johnson, if you'd like to phrase your question for them. I don't know if they were able to hear it on their way down.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was on item number 9, the increase in funding for PR and communications around Nicollet Mall. I was just wondering why we would have this increase when the mall, I believe, is supposed to be done next month, and it seems like this would continue communication through April 15th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Don Elwood, Director of Transportation Engineering and Design for Minneapolis Public Works. Your question is why the increase at this point? In essence,
Yes, is why the increase, why the additional amount
Right.
when this
When
project's about to be done.
Yeah, when I first set up this project, I was anticipating getting us through the end of this year. There's been many stages and milestones on this project, and so we celebrate those milestones as we've been going along. We just had more interaction needed, more updates on the web page than I initially thought when I set up this contract back in December. More communication was needed with our stakeholders to make sure that it's successful when we hit these milestones, that we also, on this partnership, communicate out to them that they can also understand where our milestones are in the project. Where we're at today, we're wrapping that project up, but I still need to have an event. We have a substantial completion event, which is coming up in November, and I still have 2 pieces of art to deliver in 2018, and those are signature events as well, that I want to make sure I get the communication out on those, on the Nimbus structure for the art. That's the reason for the extension on the contract.
Okay. Does that answer your question, or do you have anything additional? Just checking.
Yeah, it does. I guess I'm wondering, obviously it's a really large project, and so I can understand the need for PR and communication outsourcing that in that regard, but we also have a lot of other large projects that we have going on in the city. Do those typically have funds dedicated for outside management of communications and PR? Is that usually something that's just handled as part of the process? Is it just because this is such a large project that it's being handled differently, or is this typical?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, this is a very large public-private partnership. It is a significant project not only to the city of Minneapolis, but the state as well. We elected to bring together a communications firm to help me with keeping our webpage up to date and keeping it very timely and accurate. So each week when we have a construction meeting, we get those updates out on the webpage. And we think that's important not only for the city of Minneapolis, but also the downtown businesses and anybody else who's interested in the project. I can't speak to the other projects, but I think on this project, it's worked very well.
Thank you.
Council Vice President.
Thanks. It was helpful to hear that from Mr. Elwood. I just wanted to say for some perspective, just because I also was part of working on getting the bonding dollars for this project, that you're right, there are other big projects, but there is something that is a bit unique about kind of the level and the attention here on this project, especially with just the statewide knowledge of when you say Nicollet Mall, what does that mean? It just, and you know, and the importance to the whole business district and all of these things. It just, it is one of these projects that even though maybe in scope, it's similar to other big projects just in terms of attention, importance of that communication, all those other things. It just is really, really a big one. So I guess it's up to Public Works to kind of justify the budget around this. But I will say I think this is a really important one for us to make sure we're communicating as best possible, especially with that bonding connection to the state legislators and keeping timely.
Mr. Elwood, while you're here, I just have a follow-up on this. Is this within the budget scope of the project, or are we talking about any additional appropriation that's needed from the department?
Mr. Chair, thank you. This is within the project budget, no additional appropriation needed.
Okay. Thank you very much. Seeing no further questions on this item, I think we can go ahead and take a vote on this. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you very much for coming down. Appreciate the additional information. Mr. Ruff, you have the next discussion item, which is a receive and file item related to the sales and special taxes associated with the U.S. Bank Stadium financial overview.
Sure, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Mark Ruff. I'm the city's chief financial officer. I also want to acknowledge Mr. Rick Evans, who's with us this afternoon, and Mr. Evans is the executive director of the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority and is here not as a part of the presentation, but just as a resource in case any policy issues or questions come up. So I want to thank Rick for being here. This presentation is really a response to a staff direction that came at the end of the budget process last year. And timing-wise, we thought it would be appropriate to come back to the Ways and Means Committee after the facility, U.S. Bank Stadium, had completed a calendar year of operations, and we did then include in the packets, and there are copies as well available for the public, of the MSFA's budget for 2017 and 18. MSFA does have a fiscal year budget that was altered. It was formerly a calendar year budget, but now it is a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year. Also included in your packet is a report from the contractor, essentially the management firm for the facility, SMG. And so there is a report that they put together. And finally is this PowerPoint presentation as well that's available. Before we start about the facility itself, I know that in the past this committee has been interested in just an update on sales tax, and because in some cases the two are tied together, we thought we would quickly review some history of sales and entertainment taxes for the city, give you an update on financially where we're at. This chart shows the 5 different local taxes. There's the entertainment tax plus 4 sales tax. And at the very top of the purple is the entertainment tax. On the very bottom is the sales tax. Now you can see really over the last 16 years, the sales tax, the 0.5%, is stayed fairly flat. And the increases in the purple at the top primarily are coming from entertainment tax. And you may recall that the Metrodome, the city did not collect entertainment tax. That's a 3% amount. And so highlighted there is when Target Field opened, we had a significant increase in entertainment taxes because we started collecting that 3% on the tickets. Obviously recall that first year, I think they had something like 3.2 million visitors at Target Field, a significant amount. That's dropped down to about 2.1 million in the last season. The other big demarcation was when the Metrodome was demolished and when the Vikings went to start playing at TCF Bank Stadium. There, the ticket tax was collected, and then the GB, it is not Green Bay. You may test your memory, but if you recall that Garth Brooks played 10 sold-out concert at Target Center, that was something like 200,000 tickets that were sold just for that 10-day period. So obviously that was a very good fall for the city as well in terms of those collections. And then certainly had a bump when US Bank Stadium opened as well, because we had that increase in capacity of the fans for that facility as well as associated concerts. And some of that is reflected in the SMG report as well. Overall, year to date, we are doing fine on the year-over-year increases in both the sales and entertainment taxes. The last time I looked, which was the end of August numbers, overall we are 2.7% increase from 2016 to 2017 year to date. Without the entertainment taxes, is about 2.1. So certainly there is growth in the city in these taxes, but it's not overwhelming growth. Remember though that we've had Target Center shut down for 6 months, so clearly that impacts our tax numbers, as well as we just talked about Nicollet Mall. And while we hope that has not affected businesses too much, certainly it's had some effect upon sales and restaurant taxes as well. Also, a quick reminder then, we have these different taxes, one of which, in addition to the 0.5%, is a lodging tax for those for those facilities with more than 50 rooms. Way back in the 1980s, there was a state law passed that capped that lodging tax at 13%, and then 2 subsequent exemptions to that for the ballpark tax from Hennepin County, which is a 0.15% sales tax, and then also the original transit tax that was levied for the 5 counties that bound together for the Transit Joint Powers Group. That was a 0.25%. So what happened, there was no legislative change, but if you remember recently, earlier this year, Hennepin County and others disbanded the Joint Powers Group, and then Hennepin County instituted their own 0.5% sales tax. That was not exempted by state statute, and so it drove our lodging tax down effective October 1. We will certainly be working with the legislature to try to correct that next year, but that is in effect currently. Also then the downtown restaurant and liquor taxes, the entertainment tax, which is citywide. And it's important to remember that all these taxes are collected by the state. And so throughout this conversation, we'll be talking about taxes that are really city taxes, but for the purposes of MSFA, they get the payments directly from the state. And so you'll see some language differential in some of the documents. Just a reminder on when we talk about downtown restaurant and liquor tax, this is a boundary that is set in state statute. It's been around for a long time, but certainly is at least reflective of a previous version of what was the downtown activity. Much of the North Loop is not included in this, as well as not much of the University of Minnesota area. This is a chart that sometimes is helpful. It comes from a state Department of Revenue publication, and it shows, depending on what type of facility you have in terms of entertainment or restaurant and where you are located and whether you have live entertainment, what are the total taxes? On the far left are the state taxes. The middle, in the middle box are the county taxes, and as I mentioned, it used to be 0.25%, now up to 0.5%. And then the city taxes are on the right-hand side. And so there you can see the adjustment and the footnote down on the lodging tax as well.
Mr. Ruff, I just want to be clear. Did we raise, was the CTIB sales tax, was that raised 0.5 or was it raised 2.5?
It was raised from 0.25% to 0.5%.
I see.
Right.
Thank you.
But the exemption we had in state law was specific to the CTIB, the Joint Powers Group, and It is not included in that general law road and transit tax 0.5% that Hennepin County instituted.
On an annual basis, what would that translate to in terms of dollars?
About $1.7 million. Certainly there'll be more next year with the Super Bowl.
Okay. Thank you.
And then lastly, in terms of just our use of sales and entertainment taxes, as you know, for the last several years, those dollars just come into the general fund. And so there's not a specific apportionment of sales and entertainment taxes to any part of our budget. Certainly we have debt that we have by statutory authority pledged the sales tax to, but it's also a general obligation pledge, so we don't rely just on the sales taxes, specifically the convention center debt, and then most recently the Target Center renovation debt. But at a minimum, we have at least over $30 million, and certainly Mr. Johnson during his budget presentation will highlight a little more detail about this accounting change that we're talking about into a special revenue fund rather than the sales tax dollars going into the general fund. But materially, it doesn't change the uses whatsoever, and we're not necessarily adding substantially to any of the existing obligations, either indirectly or directly, that sales tax is paid. So when this legislation for US Bank Stadium was considered, if you remember back in 2012, it was the idea that the convention center debt, which is a 25, last year payments will be $27 million in 2020, will go away. And then starting in 2021, when primarily the amount of the city's share will be of sales taxes will be redirected toward US Bank operations, toward portion of the state's debt, and as well as capital improvements. There's currently part of the city sales tax, which is being shared with US Bank Stadium, and it's really specifically for the benefit of MSFA. And so we'll be using that term. It's not part of the overall operations of the US Bank Stadium. It doesn't go through the SMG contract, but it is a dollar amount that is increasing over a period of time. In the staff direction last December, there were also two other issues that were highlighted. It was about the city's deferred guarantee on the parking ramp that is owned, or ramps really that are owned by MSFA. Really, we don't have enough data. We don't even have a year's worth of stabilized income and expenses. I think at the time we do receive information that we feel is valuable, we will certainly come back to the committee, but that is a longer term endeavor. And then there was also mention of the park use agreement, which I've been in contact with the city attorney's office right now. We don't see any immediate issues with the park use agreement, but certainly if there are additional concerns about any of those documents, we'll be happy to answer those questions either individually or come back to the committee at a later time. So more specifically, in terms of the the 4 different areas where city taxes are being used for US Bank Stadium, as I mentioned, there was the tax that has been collected since 2014 that is for the benefit of MSFA, essentially to help operate the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority. In 2016, it was approximately $1.7 million. And that is increased. It's not just inflated, increased by a portion of the city's overall 4 sales taxes, excluding the entertainment tax, that's greater than 2%. So it's not just inflated by a rate of inflation, but actually a portion of the city's growth in those local sales taxes. There's also then the share of the debt, which the state is covering, and we will repay the state starting in 2021 for the next 25 years after that. There are the US Bank Stadium operating costs, which both the city and the Vikings make a payment towards. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as Vikings rent, but it's really, again, part of the original legislation in terms of the share of the operating cost of the facility. And then there are capital improvements for that facility over a long period of time, which, again, the city and the Vikings make payments toward. The latter two have inflation, which is based on our sales tax inflation. So if our sales tax ends up going up by 2.7%, then our share of the operating costs and our increase in the share of capital improvement costs will go up by 2.7% next year. Just a brief matter on SMG's contract with MSFA. Certainly, there are those at the authority who know much more about this contract than we do, but we've reviewed it, had conversations internally as well as externally. And it's not dissimilar to the relationship that we have with AEG at Target Center. So the city owns that facility. We have a management company that collects all the revenues from those events. We are responsible as the owner for major capital improvements. The operator is responsible for minor capital improvements. There is, in that, I would say certainly one thing that is very interesting, and part of that report that you'll see from SMG was a heavy weight for that facility and customer satisfaction. And so there are performance metrics that are outlined in the document as well. But generally, it is a very incentive-based contract, meaning that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in some of the financial charts, but there is significant incentive for SMG to produce a net income of a certain dollar amount. And they get to keep the first portion of that, and then after that, that's split between the MSFA and SMG. And so we certainly can talk more in detail about that contract, but just want you to be aware that we have reviewed it and feel like we have a comfortable understanding of it. And certainly either now or later, MSFA can answer any questions. But that was modified once to reflect this change in the fiscal year that I mentioned earlier.
Council Vice President?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I just wanted to bring up that SMG has certainly been in the news a bit lately. Asked a lot of tough questions at a state legislative hearing recently, and I'd like to know if that has prompted the city to do any additional review of SMG and its practices, management practices, and our comfort level around that.
Good.
So, Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, I am not aware of those discussions. Certainly, if Mr. Evans is, he can comment on them. But we work very closely with SMG on a number of levels and with their security subcontractors, not just on game day, but also how the Commons Park is overseen in the off hours. And so I think if there were concerns, we would certainly bring them to you. I think there was, and I certainly can talk with the police chief and with the city attorney to just double check to see if there are any concerns. I'm not aware of any at this point in time, but it is really a weekly and even day-to-day operating relationship that we have with the AEG and their subcontractors. SMG, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, and I just, I'll say again, because I'm looking at this article online right now talking about Monterey Security recently losing their contract, and of course, just the importance of all this, and as we prepare for, one of the largest events in the world to be hosted in our city, and ensuring that we've got absolute confidence in how our private partners work with our public peace officers and security personnel.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss if I didn't mention
Absolutely.
this.
Absolutely. We fully appreciate it and appreciate the comment.
We finish our
Sure.
presentation
Thank you.
here and then.
Go ahead.
So I put a few charts together here. I think sometimes, even though in the Ways and Means you're accustomed to seeing spreadsheets, sometimes it's easier just to understand just where the dollars are coming and going from just some simple charts. And so we have worked with MSFA, have received some additional financial information, and then undertaken some projections ourselves to just give you a sense of the trend. And so, especially in the title, you will see where the source is city estimates. These are our interpretations of MSFA documents. Their audit for the last fiscal year is not completed. It will be in the next couple of months, and certainly can give you an update at that point in time if you're interested in more details. So these are just generalized numbers that we feel comfortable fit within the budgetary parameters. But overall, and you can see this in the budget document, SMG does a very thorough job of laying out the details of the revenues and where they come from. But for that facility includes not just ticket sales, but also concessions, net revenues that flow up through the SMG contract. And then there is the city operating payment that currently is being made by the state of Minnesota, in which we will repay the state after 2020. There is the Vikings operating payment, and then there is event income, which includes everything from tours of that facility to rentals if someone's going to have a special event in that facility, as well as then concerts and other associated revenues. And so the facility revenues are just under $40 million projected for the next fiscal year. So out of those revenues, then the contract with SMG indicates that there's a payment made, and that payment needs to be no less than $6.75 million. So remember that that includes the city's payment to through the operating revenues to SMG, but SMG guarantees that there will be a $6.75 million payment to the MSFA. In addition, there is that dollar amount that I talked about that's directly for the benefit of the MSFA, which is an increasing amount over a period of time, and then some miscellaneous revenues. Okay, so that's operating and non-operating revenue just for the separate public agency. And then in terms of net revenues, at least through June 30th of 2017, there were multiple sources that MSFA received. They received a payment, I think $2.75 million from SMG just for the management rights early in the contract. There is also these revenues from the city via the state, and some of the miscellaneous revenues. So right now there's a cash balance, and so just under $5 million worth of revenues from inception through 2017. The audit will then separate out what was just for the fiscal year and what was prior, what was capital costs, what were operating costs. At least for 2017-18, we see expenses as higher, and that's primarily because there is both agreements and a state mandate in terms of how much of the Super Bowl cost that the U.S. Bank Stadium, and more specifically MSFA, must cover associated with that event. And so in the following year, and that's part of the reason we included the projections, we do expect that, again, absent a major event where there are concessions, we expect that the net revenues for the MSFA would average around $5 million, about the same as the expenses. Okay. So in terms of, that's the operating revenues. I would also say that within the capital improvements for that facility, there was budgeted each year direct payments of $3 million, half of which comes from the Vikings, half of which comes from the city via the state. And so it has been clear in some of the documents we've reviewed, the capital plans that were prepared in December of 2016, that the MSFA anticipates transferring some of that operating surplus to the capital funds. And at least for 2017-18, there is something just under $2 million that's anticipated for that transfer to help support capital improvements. Again, these are the more major capital improvements that the owner is responsible for. And then over the longer period of time, that's likely to increase. But again, how much of that's current year expenditures versus saving up for larger future expenditures, as we know from operating the Target Center, a major entertainment venue like this does require rather regular capital improvements to keep up with the market, keep up with technology, improve the customer service experience. The last chart that I'll outline is just to say, well, how much cash is on hand on each of these? There are really three accounts. One is a small account on the far right hand, which is there's a separate capital reserve just for the concessions, essentially for the Aramark contract. The capital reserve for the larger facility is just over $5 million, and the operating account, as I mentioned earlier, is just under $5 million. So that's the current financial situation
Can I
for
just
the MSFA.
ask for just a little clarification for my benefit? The previous slide, and I guess this one as well, when we're talking about when there's a excess, I think that's the word you used, it wouldn't be staying in an operating fund, it would be transferred to a capital.
Correct.
Is that offset somewhere about what the participation is from the city or from the state or from the Vikings? If it's not needed this year, does it go into capital and that just builds up to a pool that is not used for operating expense reductions, for example?
Sure.
Is there a way that the excess capital could be used for operating expenses going into the future, reducing anybody's requirement to pay in for those expenses.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, certainly Mr. Evans can comment. I would just say there are no legal restrictions on movement of money as you described, Mr. Chair. I think it would be a policy decision on the part of the MSFA board to decide how much they want to have for minimum reserves in operating accounts and capital accounts, similar to what the city does. But there are no legal restrictions that I'm aware of that would prevent that money movement.
Okay, thank you.
So really lastly, just in summary, I know there have been questions and concern in the community about, is this facility and is the city, especially the city's contributions to this facility, meeting what our statutory obligations are? And from my view, and remember that I was not involved in the original negotiations on this, but from my view in reviewing it in the last 18 months on behalf of the city, that seems to be in compliance with the state statute. I will tell you that we are still really not in discussions with the MSFA, but with the state through the Department of Minnesota Management and Budget. There are some details about how our reimbursement agreement with the state's going to work. For example, what if they refinance their bonds in the future? Do we get the benefit of some of that savings? What's the reimbursement rate? We're down to a difference of maybe 0.5% on what their investment rate versus what we're going to have to pay them back. So there are some details about that agreement that we are still in discussions with the state but generally we are comfortable with the overall financial situation. Also, that facility is early in its life, and so certainly evaluating what is the appropriate capital amount will be something that will be ongoing, as well as what are the operating variations that may occur in running an entertainment facility. But that's also not to say that we are not going to continue to work with the MSFA to find ways to partner on a variety of options and enhancements for the city residents and visitors experience. And what exactly those partnerships are, I'm not here to say in detail at this stage. I would just say that we are certainly very much appreciative of Mr. Evans' relationship with the city and also with the new chair, Mike Vekic. She's been very active, very involved in discussions with city staff as well. And so appreciative of that communication, which we think is healthy as well. And then also with the city's 2 individual appointed board members, we have met and will continue to keep them apprised, at least on our view of this. We do view it as a partnership, but certainly we will continue on an annual basis to ask lots of questions, report back to you on anything that we consider to be an anomaly. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Will the the audit that's underway now, as it comes, you said, at next couple of months, will that be that first question? Is it in compliance with state legislation? Is that going to be addressed in the audit as a question that'll be asked or a finding?
Mr. Chair, I think I can't speak to what's going to be in the audit's management letter, but certainly any auditor would review associated documents with the creation of a public entity and make sure that there is, at least, again, I'll use the word anomaly as something that should be alerted to as the management of those, not just management, the board itself, in terms of the operation and the financial obligations of that state agency. And so if there are major questions, I would expect that those would be addressed in the audit, but I can't speak to what the management letter will address.
Very good. Thank you. Council Vice President.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I'm just kind of trying to remember as I go back and I look at what will be the city's responsibility relating to operating costs and capital costs. And I guess well, anyway, but for that, maybe this is part of what these details you're discussing with MMB, but in essence, our responsibility is kind of set in stone in that if there's an upside to how the stadium is doing, that doesn't affect the amount that the city has to contribute to the operating or to the capital. Am I correct in remembering that?
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, you are correct.
Okay.
And the exact amount, and I think that you're referring to, is I think there was always an approximation that when 2021 rolls around, about the same amount that we were spending on the convention center debt would then be dedicated to US Bank Stadium. But honestly, it's more about how are our local taxes going to be inflating over the next several years to know that exact number. So it's not a knowable number today because it depends on how well our local taxes do and how that is then reflected in the operating capital improvement and probably the bigger number, the tax for the benefit of MSFA. But that's not going to prevent us from keeping, and as I said, entering into a partnership with MSFA, asking for some opportunities where we can have shared services. And, I think that's where we see the benefit of an upside is the more revenue that comes to that facility, the more that downtown is successful, but also more that there would be opportunities for us to find some ways to, again, partner on some enhancements or even for some existing costs. And we will continue to ask those questions and bring those to you.
So when you say partnering on enhancements, that means enhancements to the physical property. That's what you're referring, right?
Could be the physical property. It could be the parking ramps. It could be the public spaces around it. I would consider any of those to be options for discussions in the future.
I guess I'll be interested to see how that the private end of that partnership looks at what's most important to invest in. The other piece, and you just mentioned the parking ramp, so this wasn't an overview of the parking ramp issue, but I mean, that's where if there is a downside to how the stadium is doing, that is where, so we don't see an upside if there's a kind of that piece going on. But on the other hand, if there's not, things are not going so well, the parking ramp is where we may see an increase in the city's obligation. And can you just give us like a thumbnail of how things are going with that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair,
again,
Council
knowing
Vice
we're
President
early
Glidden.
in the.
Right. Mark Winkelhage, who works with me, I have spent a few hours looking at this, and honestly, I'm not being coy. I just don't think that there's enough solid information to even.
So we're still really too early to be able to say are there trends one way or another. I mean, that's fair enough. I just, not being the person in the weeds on those details, I just know it's important.
Yes.
And it's something for folks like us to continue to ask about.
I mean, number one, I think we can all look around and say parking is not becoming cheaper downtown. And so long-term, that's a valuable asset. We hope that that valuable asset then is also then translated into revenues as well. So I think the trends are positive, I can tell you that, but beyond that, we just don't have a good idea. And I think the advantage we have is, if you recall, Ryan Companies is providing the guarantee in the short term, so they have even more incentive than we do to make sure that that ramp is operating as efficiently, as effectively. They will be the larger voice in that conversation in the near term than we will be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruff. Were there any other questions or comments that either Mr. Ruff or if anybody would like the representative from MSFA to weigh in? Not seeing any. Thank you very much. This is a receive and file item. So all those in favor of that action, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That item carries. And that is the end of our agenda. So this meeting's adjourned. I would like to point out our budget hearings calendar begins again tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon. And that's what we affectionately call Public Safety Day, where we'll be hearing from fire, police, and emergency management and 911. So look forward to those beginning at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.